Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston and I am back today as your host on a Monday afternoon, a crisp Monday afternoon. And it'll feel better if you're a Manchester United fan because of the result on Sunday, where it was a tight game against Brighton in the FA Cup semi-final, but United battled on and persevered and prevailed on penalties. I'm joined by my colleague Samuel Luckhurst, who's been all over the shop this week. He's been out in Spain, he's been down to London in the capital. Samuel, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm probably on my third or fourth cup of coffee of the day, but although it was a long day, it was a rewarding one. Sets us up nicely for the week ahead with positivity. Quickly restored after the surrender in Seville last week.
It definitely was a rewarding trip in the end. Obviously, as I've said, it wasn't exactly a vintage performance, let's say, but after the defeat on Thursday, which we picked apart in last week's podcast, and we obviously criticised some performances, Ten Hag wanted a response. We all wanted to see a response from the players, and they delivered in the end. They progressed to the final, and let's face it, if you told supporters at the start of the season that they were going to win the Carabao Cup, reach the FA Cup final and qualify for the Champions League, that would have been a fantastic season. So, Sammy, what was your initial verdict leaving Wembley? Because on days like that, all that really matters is the win, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And Brighton are such a good side that it didn't really matter how United got through that semi-final yesterday, as long as they got through it. I always thought it was the bigger of the two games last week. As important as the Europa League is, its value is diminished by United's league position, in that they are all but certain to qualify for the Champions League, and they did win the Europa League a few years ago. It doesn't. I don't think any of us have shied away from the fact that the defeat in Seville was one of the worst of the season, and I think everybody could see in the aftermath of it that open season was declared, and United got both barrels after that performance. But where the character was lacking in Seville, it was back at Wembley, because the quality of United's performance was nowhere near their optimum. There was plenty wrong with it, but I don't think that Ten Hag will have looked at it in that way. He will have looked at it that it was a taxing week of playing on a Thursday, and then of course playing on Sunday, and that game always had the potential against Brighton to go right down to the wire, to go the full distance, and to go to the penalty shootout, and of course it did. So that makes it even more draining on certain players who played in midweek. And even Bruno Fernandes, he wasn't quite right after he had that ankle injury, but he still soldiered on and completed 90 minutes. And it was interesting just observing some of the players during the game, when the ball was in play, when the ball wasn't in play. I mean, Antony was probably the only time United's press worked where it forced a rare error from Moises Caicedo, who's otherwise he was near immaculate. He that generated approval from the crowd, and Antony was practically celebrating it. He was geeing up Wout Weghorst in extra time during the interval. Fernandes and Antony were like player coaches after they were substituted. They were very, very involved in the dugout. They added an edge to the dugout.
2016-esque, wasn't it? Sorry, Sam.
It was a little bit,
yeah. On Portugal, yeah.
Yeah, and Ten Hag has spoken about that character, and there were clearly players from certain backgrounds who he really does warm to, who he finds endearing. And it's not, I don't think it's a coincidence that those characters tend to be Latino players. Antony, Lisandro Martinez, Casemiro, obviously Fernandes, Rafael Varane to a lesser extent, but he lived in Spain for such a long time and is a fluent Spanish speaker. And as I said, in the week, there were too many players in that team who just haven't got the character. But even with Jadon Sancho, who there's still a big question mark over, that there isn't a question mark when he comes on in games, because it must be maddening for Ten Hag. When he comes on as a substitute, he tends to play well, and he played well again yesterday, and he showed really good bottle to put his penalty away at the opposite end to where he was denied by Gianluigi Donnarumma in the Euros final. To a lesser extent, the character showed by De Gea. He had a dreadful midweek in Seville, but his performance in the 90 minutes, or the 120 minutes, I should say, was very good. He made one particularly good save. I think it was the deflection shot. Was it Enciso's shot? I can't quite remember, but that was a very good save. His handling was good. And certain players, I'm sure we'll get onto Victor Lindelof, but he's not had a lot of game time since the season resumed after the World Cup. He started the last three. It didn't go well in Seville, but he played very well against Forest, and he played very well again yesterday, and his penalty was the pick of the lot. So it was interesting seeing that, although, and we go back to last summer, and we've discussed how with United and their recruitment, it was clear they placed an emphasis as much on character as quality, whereas in previous summers that wasn't always the case. It was always looking at the quality and not the character, and you can that can be quite if you do that, you're on a slippery slope. You look at Angel Di Maria or Paul Pogba and Romelu Lukaku, not necessarily the right characters you want in a certain dressing room, and that showed during their time at United as well. But they've got it right with these players that they've brought in, and there were still some players there from previous regimes who have that character. And Weghorst is kind of, his performance yesterday was almost symbolic of the team's performance, in that there wasn't a lot of quality, but there was a hell of a lot of effort. And when it came to the crunch of that penalty shootout, he got it right. He stuck his penalty away, and his act of kidology with Solly March might have been the most decisive act between the teams all afternoon, because the quality of the shootout, again, prior to March's miss, was excellent. De Gea seemed to be diving further and further away from penalties, and Sanchez I think he'll probably have had a sleepless night over Marcel Sabitzer's penalty, which he probably should have stopped. So in the end, it was that wiliness, that character, that just about saw United past, as I said, a very, very good team.
If anyone didn't spot it, Weghorst kissed the ball as he passed it. Solly March probably got in his head with that, and then De Gea also went to kind of scuff around the penalty,
tended
spot,
to the penalty
spot.
Yeah,
he didn't actually do it on the spot, did he? So he was just getting in his head, really, and it worked. They didn't fight it over the bar. So fair play. I'm all for a bit of gamesmanship. You've got to do that. Credit to De Gea, Samuel, as you said. I think as a goalkeeper, especially mentally, one bad game can turn into two, and he did respond. But I just kind of feel that game was probably De Gea in a nutshell. Meaning,
I don't
fabulous, fabulous shot stopping display, but he was noticeably reverted to kicking the long end, wasn't it? And he was at every opportunity, and that was obviously by design. But fair play, because he did respond, as a lot of the players did. And Lindelof and Wan-Bissaka, as you've just discussed, they were another two players who responded. Wan-Bissaka probably regressed against Sevilla, and I thought he was fantastic yesterday, actually, up against Matoma, who's become one of the best wingers in the Premier League over the last 6 months. What a find he's been for Brighton. So how impressed were you with them two? Because for me, them two, both of those players, Lindelof, Wan-Bissaka, were the stand-up performers. That Wan-Bissaka run, I think after the hour mark when he pushed forward, it was like Cafu-esque, wasn't it? Is that too far?
He did. No, he did have a very good game. There wasn't a lot of end product in the final third, but as an overall performance, he was excellent. And Mitoma, I always thought Wan-Bissaka should have started the semi-final. I know in my actual personal team, I didn't have him in the 11, because I just thought after the performance in the week where he came off at half time, it was difficult to justify it. But fair play to Ten Hag, he looked at it objectively and he thought, who is the best right back to go up against Mitoma? And of course it's Wan-Bissaka. And whereas Saint-Maximin kind of tried to take Wan-Bissaka on down the byline, that was probably his mistake, because Wan-Bissaka, that's what he wants to do against a winger. That's what he wants a winger to do against him, I should say, because there's not so much space there. And of course, everyone knows what his sliding tackles are like, and he just wins the ball off them. Mitoma tried to bypass that and just cut inside and hopefully just, catch Wan-Bissaka unawares. And I think he won a free kick early on, but that was maybe the only time he got a bit of joy against him, when he just essentially ran away from him and Anthony fouled him. When he tried it again, Wan-Bissaka was wise to it, and he got his sliding tackle in, and that set the tone for the rest of his performance, it felt to me, because in terms of the defending side of it, he did next to nothing wrong, and that spirited sprint he went on as well, it brought the crowd, the United fans, to the edge of their seat or off their seat, which is rare for him. And overall in the last 4 months, he has made strides. He's still a long way off being at the level United require for a starting right back. but there are certain occasions where it is useful to have someone who is so specific with their defending and so concentrate on the defensive side of it as a fullback, because there are so many good wingers in the Premier League. It's difficult to think of many clubs who don't have a trick up their sleeve via a winger. I mean, Martinelli's obviously been excellent for Arsenal. City have got plenty of them. Liverpool have got plenty of them. Tottenham, even, I know Tottenham are Tottenham, but they've still got players on their day who can give you a really tough game. And there was a lot of focus on Mitoma because of what a find he's been at Brighton, and there was a fascinating feature on him in the Sunday Times yesterday, and that game was set up for him to send their Japanese Twitter account rocketing into six figures, probably. I think it was on 38,000 at kickoff yesterday. But he just didn't really have much joy against Wan-Bissaka, and I suppose it was a bit of a risk by Ten Hag to take Wan-Bissaka off at the time he did, and he moved the pieces around, and Dalot went to right back and Malacia went to left back. And of course, Brighton worked that little opening towards the end of extra time where Mitoma's touch was just too heavy and he ended up needlessly colliding into De Gea. But there are certain players there in Wan-Bissaka and Lindelof. They've not so much improved, because Wan-Bissaka's first season at United was actually good, but certainly on last season, Ten Hag has got a rise out of them. And in Wan-Bissaka's case, it is more impressive because he barely had a kick in the first 3 or 4 months of the season. So he has, to an extent, come good. But as I said, I still think he's a long way off the level that Ten Hag wants, which is why United are looking at Jeremy Frimpong, who's not, I mean, right back is not necessarily a priority. In fact, it's quite a long way down the list in terms of areas that United need to strengthen, but it is something to keep an open mind on. And with Lindelof, I've been a little bit baffled why he hasn't played more often since the World Cup. I think that he's shown the first few months of the season that he should absolutely be the third choice centre-back there. He seemed to have quite a good understanding with Lisandro Martinez when they played alongside each other in October and November. And apart from maybe one misjudgment where he carelessly conceded a corner early in the second half, and it led to a couple of opportunities for Brighton. I think it was the shot that De Gea saved, and then Welbeck had the free header at the far post. His reading of the game was excellent, and it's interesting with his penalty kicks. I was pretty certain that he'd scored for Sweden's under-21s when they won the Euros in 2015, and he had, it was actually the winning spot kick in the final, and it was a similar technique, aiming high, well out of the goalkeeper's reach. His penalty in the Europa League final was rather similar, and I think he was the last of United's outfield takers, so it was obviously the last penalty they scored against Villarreal. If they're involved in another shootout and he's on the pitch, I think a lot of United fans now will be wondering, if he's not among the first 5 takers, why isn't he? Because what was fascinating was that you could see, I don't know if the pictures picked it up, but Fernandes was pretty much, as soon as he noticed it was Lindelof going to take the penalty, he was lining up the players and staff to get ready to embark on a celebratory charge, because he was so convinced that Lindelof was going to stick it away. And it was the best of the 13 penalties converted. There were some really good penalties, but that was the best by far. It was top corner, and it was just his stride as well. He was so casual the way he approached the ball, yet his connection was absolutely perfect. I mean,
that's why they call him
no
the Iceman,
goalkeeper
Samuel.
was going to get that.
Name comes from.
I know he lived up. He lived up to his billing with that penalty. He certainly did. And as I said, I think that I know he obviously said last month that he may have to evaluate his situation in the summer, but he's a player that, looking ahead to next season, United should be planning with him in mind. I think it would be senseless to proactively look to get him off the books unless a big offer comes in, which is probably unlikely.
The two players who I had doubts over stepping up were Weghorst and Sancho, which, to be fair, probably most fans had doubts over, and composed penalties brilliantly taken. So fair play to both of them, especially Sancho, as you've just talked about, with the Euros missing that and coming back and at Wembley, the scene of the crime as such. Going back to Wan-Bissaka quickly, Samuel, we've talked about character. And Wan-Bissaka was out in the cold at the start of the season. He was told he could leave the club had that 4-minute cameo against Liverpool. Then I think it's 170 days he didn't play for again. Obviously, he came back against Burnley in the League Cup. But to force his way back into Ten Hag's plans, that's what I kind of wrote about today. And don't get us wrong, I think we can all agree, as you've just said, the jury remains out on his long-term future and what lies next. But in the meantime, this season, I've just been so impressed by his character, his resilience, and to come back and to actually make a battle at right back with Diego Dallo, who we all regarded as the first choice out-and-out right back. And this has been once a likely battle that's now developed, and Ten Hag's chopped and changed between the pair. So he really deserves credit for that, doesn't he, in showing that kind of resilience to battle back into the team.
Yeah, he does. And he took his chance in the Dallo was got an injury at the World Cup. He came in and he had that opportunity, and he's done pretty well by and large, as I said, over the last. It is pretty much 4 months now. So yeah. He's given himself a chance in terms of staying at United beyond this season. There are always going to be doubts about him, as there are doubts about a number of players at the club. I mean, I don't think United are able to put a specific number on outgoings, but they are aware that there need to be a lot of outgoings, and there's an element of them being a bit self-congratulatory about the players that left last year, referring to the ones who actually left on frees, which is a bit peculiar in that their contracts ran down, and in a couple of those cases they were trying to get them to sign new contracts. I mean, Jesse Lingard was in discussions over a new contract. Why? Paul Pogba was in discussions over a new contract, or his agent was again.
It almost seems a lifetime ago that, but it doesn't at the same time.
I know it does. Ronaldo, it does.
It's crazy. Yeah, I season.
Yeah, it almost makes me feel 10 years younger. But that's the I suppose the mental perils of covering Manchester United. What happened less than a year ago feels like it was about 10 years ago. So much happens in between. So yeah, with Wan-Bissaka, you can't get too carried away. Similar with De Gea. I know De Gea is obviously almost certainly going to stay because again they're in discussions over renewal, and I still think it's inevitable that he'll sign it. But his performance in the final, it was saving saves he should make. The most impressive one was the deflected one, but I thought the best save of the day was Robert Sanchez from Rashford. That was a borderline great save. With De Gea, you kind of saw the best and worst of him in that his kicking actually started all right, but then it regressed, and to the point that at goal kicks, Brighton fans were there was airing their sardonic chant about him, which I suppose is unrepeatable. And when it came to the penalty shootout, the poor bloke, it was geared up for him to have another Gdansk, in that he lost both coin tosses as to who was going to take it first and which end it was going to be, because obviously Brighton took the penalties. The penalty was taken up the Brighton end, and Brighton went first as well. And De Gea's penalty record is pretty infamous. He did kind of claw it back last season by denying Mark Noble and Ismail Assar, but I think Ty said he's in shootouts he's conceded his last 17 now, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when the game went to penalties, I was sure that United were crashing out. I thought Brighton were going to win at that point. You never. The only thing that at the spot.
The only thing that I thought United have a chance here is because it quite coincidentally prior to yesterday, they'd won one shootout in their last 8, which was against Rochdale, and the goalkeeper for Rochdale that night was Robert Sanchez.
It was a funny quirk
on loan there. Yeah. I mean, what are the odds? And,
exactly.
And that night there was a penalty save by United goalkeeper, but of course it was Sergio Romero. De Gea had a night off, so I think the only previous shootout De Gea would have been involved in would probably have been the Sunderland League Cup game, when in fairness he did make a couple of saves, but that evening is more infamous for Phil Jones booting the ball at someone's face and the crowd and kicking the ball like he was a rugby player. But it's not the first time Phil Jones has kind of more resembled a rugby player than a football player. So some overdue luck in a shootout for De Gea anyway, and he didn't even have to make a save.
Just had a quick Google of where Sergio Romero is now, because I knew he went to Italy. But do you know where he is now, Samuel? I bet you do. But I
He was at
didn't.
Venezia, wasn't he? But I don't know if he is still.
Boca Juniors, no.
Boca Juniors? Yes, yeah. He
Yeah, I
went
didn't
there in the
know that.
summer,
So
didn't he?
there you go. We'll end that for part 1, and we'll be back in a moment for part 2. Now, just before we get into part 2, Samuel, I'll direct the listeners across to the YouTube channel where we have Erik ten Hag's press conferences being uploaded now. So go ahead, check them out, and I'm sure you can hear Samuel and Ty asking questions. And also, we're doing it as an extra podcast now, so make sure to check that out on Spotify and Apple and whatnot, or wherever you listen to the podcast. Samuel will continue with the analysis. I thought it was worth talking about Fred, because he came on around 60 minutes, replaced Christian Eriksen, who looked a bit leggy. Don't think he's had after looking so good against Nottingham Forest, I think he's had a bit, the 2 games weren't too good. Fred's come in, and that's what he brings for me, is energy and legs in that midfield, and I thought he really made the difference. And I didn't think it was a coincidence that after Fred got introduced to the game, that coincided with the best spell of the game for United. There was around 10-15 minutes from the hour mark, I think 75, where United looked quite good and looked like they were going to score. Do you think it's been a bit bizarre, really, that Fred's not started as much this season? He's made 10 Premier League starts. Last season, he made 24 Premier League starts. Or do you just think it was always going to happen with Casemiro coming in? Obviously, Fernandes is a movable object in that midfield, isn't he? So he's been a bit of a spare part this season, hasn't
he? He hasn't. I think that Ten Hag was managing him sensibly up until maybe last month.
6 weeks ago.
And when Casemiro was suspended, you thought, well, okay, well, Fred will get a look in now. And he's not actually started in the league since the thumping at Liverpool, which is, I mean, you could read into that what you will, but I think that would be quite harsh on him, given some of the other starts that day and certain performances some of those players have had since then as well. I mean, Weghorst has started in the Premier League since that annihilation, but he is an extremely useful player. Again, he's a player that you can't say with absolute certainty he will be at United next season, just because Ten Hag wants a midfielder, and if they're going to sign a midfielder is going to cost a lot. And how do you bankroll that? Well, you have to sell a midfielder. Who is the midfielder they would sell? Possibly Fred, because he's 30, because 2 of the midfielders were signed in the summer, and because McTominay is the youngest midfielder, so you do not want to be upping your average age. But we'll wait and see. Nevertheless, I think he has worth in the United squad beyond this season. He doesn't get injured very often. He's very energetic. He certainly, when we were looking at the game yesterday, and it was clear that United needed to freshen it up somewhere or other because the performance level wasn't particularly good, and it didn't seem likely that Ten Hag would make a change to the front 4, even though, I mean, Marshall, he wore gloves and they stayed on the whole game because he clearly didn't do enough jogging to actually warm up. But it was a sensible move to take Eriksen out, because there are a lot. I mean, he does come off quite a lot in games anyway, but he did look leggy in the week against Sevilla. He looked possibly leggier against Brighton. And of course, Fred has that good understanding with Casemiro. He knows him and has played with him a number of times in the national side. And if it's going to penalties, you've also got a pretty decent penalty taker. I think he's probably scored 2 out of 2 for United. There are certain United players who have unassumingly good penalty shootout records. Yesterday was 3 out of 3 for Diogo Dalot. It might even be 3 out of 3 for Fred. In fact, he might have scored against Middlesbrough last year as well. So you've got to always think with that in mind, especially where you get to a position that you're taking off two very good dead ball strikers in Fernandes and Antony. You've got to ensure that you have a good number of players you can trust from 12 yards, and Fred is one of those players. So he certainly did energise United, and they had that with Sancho as well. As I said, I thought Sancho was very creative and much more penetrative and probing on the ball than he was in Seville, where he just hid that night. And that's why, again, there's always going to be a question mark about him going forward. But where where United have got Casemiro and Eriksen available at the moment, that's always going to make you think, well, Fred is going to struggle for starts. But maybe looking ahead to that Tottenham game on Thursday, that does strike me as a game that you may want to have him involved in. And also, biggest of all, the FA Cup final, the last time United played City, Anthony came out of the team and Fred went into it as a tactical tweak to counter City. It was probably the only time all season that Christian Eriksen started as the number 10, and that was to accommodate Fred. And he's had he's had at least 3 really good big performances this season: Tottenham home, Barcelona away, and City at home. I think, did I say no? I meant Barcelona at home. Sorry, when he got the equaliser. But even away at Barcelona, he had a dreadful first 50 minutes. But after Barcelona went 1-0 up, he was really good. He played a brilliant ball for Rashford to equalise, and he had a strong end to that game. So he's got that big game now about him, and you can't write him off as being a possible starter in the cup final, I don't think. I think that's something that Ten Hag absolutely has to consider. With the options he has, especially as well, if Garnacho's fit for that, you have to look and wonder, do you play Rashford up front? Do you play Garnacho on the left, or do you play Fernandes on the wing? Possibly. I think United will be in a injury permitting, of course, but I think United have got a reasonable chance of having quite a good squad to assemble for that cup final as far as game changers go to turn to on the bench.
We said on Friday's podcast that although this team does throw in the occasional shocker, they do have form for bouncing back under Ten Hag and showing that character. You think about that Liverpool defeat, the 7-0, they come out and they win, defeat Real Betis quite comfortably in the end. And obviously they've done that again this weekend. But I think Ten Hag talked after the game about, look, that's what we need to learn. We need to deal with these setbacks during the game, not in the next game, and they need to produce consistency. Now, that's the challenge for next season, isn't it, Samuel? But how worrying is it going to be, see if at the start of next season and we have these occasional performances creeping in again? Because it's really going to hinder the progress this team can make, because they really do need to find consistency, because that's the biggest criticism of them this season, despite the progress, despite the good results, is they can throw in a shocker, can't they? And even though they bounce back, it just can't happen.
And he always says it can't happen, and then it happens again. So that he will be extremely frustrated about that. I mean, I think post Sevilla was probably the angriest I've heard him in defeat, because I think he will have known how bad that looked and how bad it was. And crikey, it was dreadful. I think we were all a little bit gobsmacked in a way that United could still serve up such dross, having done it a few times already this season. So in some ways it was a surprise, but in most ways it wasn't a surprise, unfortunately, for United. And when you're coming up against the 13th placed team in La Liga, if you're cowed or if you're unnerved by some ticker tape coming down from the stands and some Andalusians chanting loudly, then you're at the wrong club. And I think Ten Hag knows that quite a few of them are at the wrong club. It wasn't even an acid test in Seville, but it was a test for some players, and I mean they all failed it, but some are going to be there next season, some won't be there next season, and that's why United need to be proactive with their outgoings. Their away form, I remember when you raised it about 4 or 5 weeks ago, maybe not even that long ago, and I said at the time I didn't see it as a concern because there's still enough time in the season and it's Ten Hag's first season. But then I think since then the Newcastle game and the Sevilla game have happened, and it is a justifiable concern now. And when you look at their away form, United have actually beaten, I think it's the bottom 5 leads: Leicester, Everton, Forest, Southampton. They've beaten them away from home. They've not played Bournemouth yet away, who are 15th. They have played Wolves away, who are 14th. They beat them. So their record away from home against the fodder is pretty immaculate. The trouble is when you scroll up the table and you look at, it sounds a bit random, but the top 12. So 12th, Palace away, drew. Chelsea away, drew. Brentford away, thumped. Fulham away, won very, very narrowly with an added time goal. Not played Brighton yet. Liverpool annihilated. Villa, it's a bit of a horror show that nobody mentions because there are more horrific performances. Tottenham away is on Thursday. Newcastle away, horror show. City away, horror show. Arsenal away, lost narrowly, but that scoreline really did flatter them.
Yeah.
So looking at it like that, I mean, I think that's something like, what is it? 3 points against Fulham, a point against Chelsea, a point against Crystal Palace. Is it what, five points against the top 12?
I argue the point they've become flat track bullies almost, defeating the lower half teams, but there's just big atmospheres, big games away from home, and they're struggling. They really are.
Yeah, and that will be the concern for Ten Hag, as you say. They are big games, they are big atmospheres. The atmosphere at St James's Park is, and I've experienced good atmospheres at St James's Park before, because Newcastle did have a couple of good wins against them under Benitez and then Steve Bruce, but it was a different atmosphere. And you saw what Newcastle did to Tottenham yesterday. I mean, they really probably should have topped Philippe Albert's chip in 1996, but that was just beyond them, unfortunately, for the Toon. So going into next season, that has got to be addressed, because I thought the performance away at Chelsea in the first half was pretty good, and they had 2 great chances to be ahead at half time, but overall it was quite an even game, and the draw was fair, and that was a draw that Casemiro got in added time as well. So if you were to boil it down to actually their away record against the top 11, the points have only been gained with goals in stoppage time. Well, the 3 points were gained in stoppage time, and obviously the point at Chelsea was in stoppage time. So there's not really an acid test away from home to come between now and the end of the season. The game against Tottenham is a big game, but it's not as big as it perhaps should have been, or the rights holders would have hoped it would be, because Tottenham are being Tottenham at the moment. I don't think West Ham away, that doesn't have the makings of a big game. Brighton away is a really good test for United, because Brighton are an excellent side, as we said, and that's going to be that's always very, very tough going there. I don't think United have ever really had it easy there, apart from the first game behind closed doors, and the second one somehow they won, and when they were very, very fortunate to, with that penalty that was awarded after the game had ended randomly. Very, very strange times. And I think they're away at Bournemouth in the penultimate weekend of the season, but that's not even on telly, which would indicate that the rights holders think Bournemouth will have stayed up by then and United will be in the top 4. So it has to. They can improve it between now and the end of the season, but the issues are still going to stand come the end of the season, whether they win all those away games, whether they lose all those away games, or whatever they do.
And to be fair, obviously, I know it's a cliche, and I've said it many, many times in this podcast, but this year was always going to be a quote-unquote transitional period. And yet, they've defied expectations. They've had a fantastic year. So there was always going to be something to work on, wasn't it, going into next year? And out of all the things to work on, all the things you can kind of, pick out, like away form, it's kind of understandable going away at these big games. It is going to be difficult, but it does need to be solved. You can't be folding when you represent Manchester United in the manner that have in a few of these games this season. But on big games, I know you said it's not a big game, but I'll pretend it is. We'll leave that there for part 2. We'll be back in a moment for part 3 to discuss Tottenham. Now, Samuel, as you've mentioned, Newcastle absolutely steamrolled Tottenham on Sunday afternoon just before the game at Wembley. 5 goals in 20 minutes. I could not believe my eyes, believe me. And 6-1 was the final score. I don't know what Tottenham were thinking, replacing Conte with Stellini, really. Stellini is just like this Conte was among the players. Obviously, there's questions over the players' mentality, but to sack Conte and keep Stellini, it was baffling, really. And I think they're just reaping what they sowed. United a visit in London on Thursday night. What are your expectations for the game? Because I'm hoping for quite a dominant performance, because this season from United, that's one thing we've not saw for them, really. We've not saw them put a team to the sword in the Premier League. We've not saw a big scoreline. So if Newcastle can do it, come on, United have individually got the better talent. Let's see a big scoreline. Let's see some goals. Let's see the goals flowing. Do you think that's going to happen?
No. I'd be, given how egregious Spurs were at Newcastle, I would be staggered if they are somehow
worse.
They
have to buck up right guys, won't
they? There has to come a point, and we saw it with Liverpool. Liverpool got an absolute tonking by Real Madrid. And I remember saying at the time, I said, that's actually probably the worst thing that could have happened for United, because you can bet your life that they are not going to do that when United turn up. And of course they didn't. There were 7 more goals at Anfield, and this time they all went to the home team. With Tottenham, the atmosphere there last year was pretty toxic, because it was Nuno Espirito Santo's last game. You had the farce of Tottenham's process trying to get a new manager, and it seemed like they talked to every available manager on the planet before settling for Nuno Espirito Santo, who they'd initially ruled out because he jarred with what they wanted from a manager. And then in the end, they decided to appoint him, and he lasted about 5 minutes, and that was his last game. And United went into that game on the 6 days after getting thumped by Liverpool 5-0, which did signal the beginning of the end for Solskjaer, and he shouldn't have been in charge at Tottenham, but they didn't have a succession plan, believe it or not. So he limped on for a few more weeks, and that was his last win. So that was just goes to show what a bad shape Tottenham were in at the time. And even when Conte was their manager against United in the 2 games at Old Trafford earlier in the season, Tottenham were really, really bad. United were great. United were, I said at the time, I think it was their best performance in 5.5 years that I'd seen watching them. They were absolutely switched on. They should have beaten them 6-1. The chances they had that night, they were excellent. It's certainly as a performance that still represents the high point under Ten Hag. And United's form in the Premier League has picked up, certainly since the Newcastle game. They did the job against Brentford in a professional way. They had enough chances to win a month full of games against Everton, but only won by a modest 2 goals to nil. And it was the same against Forest, where they were pretty relentless in the second half. They did step it up after a relatively even first half, but they got the job done. So in terms of putting a team to the sword, I still have my doubts they'll do that this season. I think that may be something to look to for next season. And Tottenham have still got something to play for. It sounds strange to say that. It feels strange that they're even 5th in the league table, and if they do beat United, then they go only 3 points behind them. But United have got the 2 games in hand. I mean, however you try and dress it up or try and dramatise it, I don't think anybody thinks that United will throw it away as far as top 4 is concerned. Obviously, Aston Villa are on a great run under Unai Emery at the moment, but the momentum is certainly with Newcastle, and United have regained momentum as far as their league form is concerned. And it is a big week with Tottenham away and Villa at home, the 2 teams below them in the table. But where that FA Cup final place has been secured, and where Tottenham are just Tottenham at the moment, it doesn't feel quite as big as it maybe should be, because there won't be a Tottenham fan out there who thinks that they can usurp United at this stage.
Certainly not the ones who left after 20 minutes at St James's Park, I'd think so. Regarding any changes for the game, Samuel, obviously the back 4 Wembley with Dalot, Lindelof, Luke Shaw at left centre-back, and Wan-Bissaka. With Shaw playing at left centre-back, he kind of came out after and he said it was a position he enjoys. It's a role that he quite likes, and he's been exceptional in the position this season when he's been called upon. Do you think Harry Maguire comes back into that side on Thursday? Because to be honest, I'd be half tempted just to persevere with the back 4 that played against Brighton, but I think politically he'll probably put Maguire back in.
Well, politically, he probably shouldn't put Maguire back in, because then he undermines the club's outlook on the future. Look, you saw. Do
you think he will? I think he'll play. I think he'll play. I'll be impressed.
Not necessarily.
I'd be quite taken. Yeah,
I think if he is a seriously ruthless coach, he would not play him, because you look at the recent games, and what game did United's defence have the best performance in? And it was against Brighton, and that was without Maguire. Against Forest, he gave away a foul, got booked. There was a penalty check on a handball, and it was the right decision. I didn't think that was a penalty. And then of course you go to Seville, and he's involved in the capitulation, the capitulation from United that night. I just don't see any logic to playing someone who, objectively, in my opinion, is the 5th best centre-back at United. Shaw has started 7 games at centre-back this season. United haven't lost one of them yet. I think they've won 5, drawn 2. He's slotted in really impressively there. And you can say, well, you're coming up against Harry Kane, who is one of the best strikers on the planet. Shaw did fabulously against the best striker on the planet in Erling Haaland back in January. Lindelof has got good rhythm at the moment. He's had 2 good performances against Forest and Brighton. And I also think he looks a lot more comfortable playing on the right side of defence when Maguire plays. Maguire has to play on the right side of defence. Lindelof did quite well earlier in the season when he had a left footer next to him in Martinez. So you've got to do what's best for the team. And what's best for the team, in my opinion, and I'm sure a lot of others would go along with it, is to go with Shaw and Lindelof. I'm not convinced about 2 right-footed fullbacks starting. I thought that was a...
It's not a good look on Malacia
yesterday. It's not a good. It's not a good look on Malacia, but Malacia has not looked good either when he's played of late. And also yesterday he got skinned. I can't remember who it was. It was right in front of us towards the end of extra time. But there's a lot of work to be done there at the moment. You cannot say that he's a good defender, and Dalot is the better defender. Wan-Bissaka is a far better defender. So there would be some logic going with it, but it's a means to an end. Nobody's pretending that United see 2 right-footed fullbacks as the way forward. It's unfortunate for... Well, unfortunate is probably pushing it. In fact, I mean, Ten Hag signed Malacia. He saw Malacia. If Malacia can't hack it, then that's on Ten Hag. Yeah. It's on the player. They've got to work that out at some point or another, so that he's in a position where he can feel comfortable starting him in a game of some significance again. So with the back four, I wouldn't be totally against Ten Hag going with the same back four that played at Wembley. And as for the front 6, the way it's shaping up, it wouldn't be a surprise if he was to go with, I suppose, overall the same side again. But I do think it's worth considering Fred as the option, since he's extremely fresh. I mean, he didn't even go. He wasn't in the Brazil squad during the March internationals, so he's got to be fresh as a daisy, and you've got to maximise that at this stage of the season. I mean, the cup final is just under 6 weeks away, I think it is.
3rd of July, yeah.
You don't want to be, 3rd of June. So you don't want to be leaving him undercooked for that. And as I said, I think there's an outside chance he could be starting that if he's fit.
I tell you what, I'm furious to have made the FA Cup final. I'm mentally on the beach at that point. Working on July 3rd.
It's in June, I know.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, June. I'm saying July.
Blame FIFA giving the World Cup to Qatar and holding it in the winter. What a great
I'm completely on the same page with you, Samuel, with the back four, but something inside it tells us you'll play Maguire, which is contradictory, considering you're right. We do kind of consider we want the biggest ruthless manager. I can definitely see it happening when the teams are confirmed on Thursday. Something to look forward to. I'll send you a message as soon as the teams are released, and we'll have a little laugh in one way or the other. Thank you very much for your time, Samuel.
Thank you, Stephen.
Absolute pleasure, and thank you to listeners as usual. Have a brilliant week. Enjoy the game on Thursday, and we'll be back on Friday for a post-Tottenham podcast. Thanks and take care.